I wanted to do something a little bit different from what Marcelin did last time, which I thought was a really great kind of snapshot of where things were. And so rather than repeat that and try to come up with another snapshot, I wanted to see if I couldn't maybe point things in a slightly different direction. So I came up with 5 points, because that's what you do. And so we're going to go through, there's 4 parts and 5 points. It didn't quite work with 5 parts, so I'm sure you'll feel there are plenty more of parts by the time you get to the end. So if you feel like you're missing a part, don't worry. And so it's almost 1 point per part. So we'll start with this. This is something that we hear all the time in, or versions of it all the time around studio. And I think if you think about it, it's easy to argue that it's correct. I think it's just as easy to argue that it's incorrect. And I think it has a lot to do with your point of view. And I think we can argue about whether it's correct or incorrect, but I don't think there'd be much argument about the fact that it's a cliche. And I wanted to talk a little bit about cliches today. The word itself comes from a French term for an onomatopoetic French term from typesetting, which it means it's a gang of letters from oft-used phrases that were in single units. And they think that the word may have come from the sound that it made when you melted together a bunch of words to have them at the ready when you typeset. Cliché, it sounds like melting metal. But of course it means, in writing it comes to mean the overuse of conventions and phrases. Like once upon a time, for instance, would be one. And in design, I think it comes from overused tropes and techniques. And whether we look at the sort of POMO overuse of historical quotation, or maybe more recent overindulgence in things like parasites. You all know what I'm talking about. So what I wanted to do today, though, was spend a little bit of time figuring out why the beginning of this is not here. Shit. Huh, okay. I wish I could see the words as they were coming, but I cannot. Let me just take a quick look. So it's easy to say, we look at something that's nothing new. We look at something like Frank Gehry, for instance, and we could say that, yeah, there's not so much new here. We've seen it in Bilbao. We've seen it in downtown. If we trust Peter Eisenman, we see that he actually got the idea from Schinkel. And so the whole process of domestication kind of falls into place, right? That we can kind of take a thing and make it seem not so new by demonstrating how easily it is to connect it to what's old. And so if we take that and we say, okay, well, based on the plan anyway, Peter says that the Lewis building has something to do with Schinkel's Altus Museum, then we already put it into a very long line of things that it also has to do with, like Sterling Staatsgalerie. You can see all the pieces in play, whether it's the row of trees here replaced by the kind of junk in the front, the void in the middle by the void in the middle, the little split in the U-shaped bar that runs around. We can see most of those things happening in Le Corbusier's building in Chandigarh, back to the Altus Museum, which takes us, we keep pushing back and we find all of the pieces in Burlington's Chiswick House, and then on back to Palladio, and we could keep going, and there's several steps that we won't bore you with, and eventually arrive here. So the move is basically one of getting things back to basics. Now, I think it's just as easy to say that there's all kinds of new in every one of those things. If we look at it in the opposite direction, we look at the primitive hut, it is an awfully strange collection of trees. That this is a real innovation in some sense. And if we look at something like the Parthenon, which is often traced back to the primitive hut, we see, whether we look at this in terms of the conversion of wood detailing to stone, whether we look at this as the conversion of myth to reality, whether, there's any number of ways to look at this as a significant piece of novelty. Palladio, similarly, we look at Palladio, and this is the first time, or the almost first time, that a temple front was used on domestic architecture. All kinds of things going on here that simply were not present in previous architecture. And then, of course, when we look at Palladio's plans, we see the kind of mysteriousness, let's say, about programmatic specificity. We see that starting to change in Burlington's Chiswick House, and where each of the rooms gets a program, and they're pretty simple, like closet and red closet and gallery and things like that. But that programmatic specificity in all the pieces seems to keep going in Schinkel. Notice again how that U-shaped wrapper kind of wraps around and then pinches the stairs in the middle, and then it's kind of held together by the porch, which is exactly what's going on here at Chiswick House. You see that wrapper kind of hinging around in the galleries and then bending in again and being kind of stapled shut by the classical porch. Notice the appearance of the voids on either side of the drum in Schinkel. We see that void being populated much more loosely, but all the same pieces. In Chandigarh, we see the free plan making its way in. We see the columns, which were one of the innovations of Schinkel's version of this, becoming a kind of field. Then on to Stirling, where all of the pieces are still present, although the porch is kind of turned back into trees, which is maybe a kind of funny nod. And you get the idea that each of these things kind of moves from novelty to novelty to novelty. So what we could see is that the question is not really whether it's new or not, it's a question of how you describe it. And I think that we have a tendency often to describe things in terms of domesticating similarities. And I think one of the things that we want to do in Thesis is to talk about projects in terms of novelties and differences. So point number one is going to be privilege difference over similarity. Look for those moments where the examples start to move into new terrain or territory, as opposed to looking for ways to kind of circle it back into the fold. Now, I want to look a little bit more specifically at cliches, at how they work. And, oh, that's right, there's a whole piece of paper missing. That's why this isn't working right. So I already talked, so nothing new under the sun is also a cliche, as we talked about. And cliches work in a very specific way. They operate by repetition. They eradicate authorship. If you remember back to that phrase, once upon a time, nobody in the room knows who knows it. There's all kinds of debate, or who originally wrote it. There's all kinds of debate. My favorite theory is Charles Perrault, the brother of the French architectural theorist Claude Perrault, who used the phrasing "Il était une fois" in all of his fairy tales that he wrote while he was writing dense, multi-volume works of architectural theory. But in any event, cliches tend to eradicate authorship, and they tend to follow a formula. And that formula is 5 points, like all good formulas, and it works like this: that each cliche, they are born of innovation. They sort of mature through repetition. They're codified. They're parodied, and then finally are melted together into that handy one-size-fits-all letter set of the cliche. And so I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how that happens very quickly. So if we start with the innovation, we can look at something like this. Not a brand new use of reinforced concrete, none of this is brand new, but it is a kind of introduction of a nice tight package of several concurrent innovations into one thing. So we could look at this as the kind of innovation. The repetition, we're all familiar with. Getting better, getting worse, getting more interesting, getting more ambitious, whatever. Lots to talk about there. Codification, of course, we're also very, very familiar with. The 5 points of Le Corbusier, which he lays out in 1926. The pilotis, the free plan, the roof garden, the free facade, and the ribbon window. Notice 2 points for facades, no points for doors. And notice how he cancels the point about free facade and just turns it into ribbon window. So he's already kind of stacking the deck, pointing you in a certain direction. But where the part that I think we really need to pay attention to is parity. And so once that codification is there, it's very easy to keep doing it. And so if we look at the kind of lowbrow parity, like the crappy apartments on Overland, or the Getty Center up just a little bit further west, both of these are a kind of parodic repetition of the Corbusian 5 points. And then the final hardening of this into cliché we could see in something like that, where it's simply a kind of reflexive use of a very well-established trope. Now, this happens all over the place, and just to make sure that we are on top of this idea of the cliché, I want to just run through that one more time in a slightly different context. So if we look at the innovation of Gangnam Style, which is then very quickly repeated, so goes from 90 million to 1 billion views in about a month and a half. It is codified. There is a 5 points of Gangnam Style. Here they are. Quite easy. It is very quickly falls into parody. Now, this was spelled wrong in the lowbrow version, but nonetheless, we see the kind of popular culture and, I guess, high culture parodies of Gangnam Style. And then finally, it's cliché as the sort of birth of a new kind of wedding dance. So I guess the point of this is that it's a slippery slope from the Maison Domino to the electric slide. And I want to just call that to everyone's attention as we move through. Now, if we look back at this list again, I think generally, I would say the first 4 are all perfectly reasonable places to locate your thesis. I think in general, thesis projects are mostly in 2 and 4. There are a couple of ambitious 3s. Every once in a while, we get a 1. We get a bunch of 5s, which I would like to eliminate. So I want to move everybody down the line. I think it's very useful to do a good repetition project, a sort of development project. I think certain among you are maybe suited to the codification project. I think parody is probably where we're most exciting. I think there, and there I don't mean like taking something and making fun of it, but I do, like, can you begin to sort of twist its principles, twist its organization into something that it wasn't intended to do, like the crappy apartments or the Getty Center. So that's kind of where I am on cliches. Now, we're familiar with this story about cliches. We've all read our Francis Bacon, or our Deleuze on Francis Bacon, and we know that in this book, Deleuze was working very hard on a project of cliché breaking. And what he was really trying to do was to attack the cliches of both representational art, which we see over there with Ilya Repin. Abstract art was also under the attack in that book. We tend to forget that sometimes in casual readings of that book. But both abstraction and representation had been seen in that text to be kind of sliding toward cliché. And so Deleuze's answer to that was to assert the figure, this thing that stepped over intellection, was able to kind of impress itself directly on the central nervous system. You all know this. If you don't know this, go back and read that book. And just the one chapter on the diagram is probably enough to get it. And so, but we have spent a fair amount of time around here talking about this problem of cliché breaking, which I think is a little bit what happens in parodies, is that the parody is a version of keeping something from hardening into a cliché. But something that I think an unfortunate side effect is inadvertent cliché making. And if we look at something like the cliché generation engine of Sucker Punch, I think that this is something that really, not to discount all of the good that it does in kind of getting a lot of information out there, I think it does have an unfortunate side effect of producing cliched versions of significant innovations very quickly. Nothing against Marcos and Marjan or whatever that project is. But I do think we have to be careful about that. So point number 2 that I want everybody to keep track of is to avoid the making of cliches. Now, the third point, we're going to go very quickly through the way I used to do it. The third point is to privilege how over what. So one way to avoid the problem of making cliches is to shift the way we're looking at it, to look at the problem differently, to talk about it differently. I used to do a version of this lecture where I would talk about this project, which I think is really one of the great projects of the late 20th century, Norman Foster's Willis, Faber, and Dubas building in Ipswich, which is just like phenomenally cool and weird in a number of ways. It's a kind of parody of all kinds. He follows all the rules that everybody sets down, but does them in a way that made everybody mad. I mean, it's a really fantastic building to pay attention to. But I wanted to do something new this year, and I think that the cliche that we're not paying sufficient attention to is vocabulary. I think that the way we're very good at making really important and useful and worthwhile developments of existing problems. We're very good as a crucible of developing new problems. I think that the praise that is often heaped upon the thesis program is warranted. But one of the things, maybe a bit of a blind spot that seems to be emerging is in the vocabulary. We tend to, in spite of the aggressive innovation in the studios, we have a tendency to retreat back to the kind of fairly familiar linguistic tropes of kind of the hangover of critical culture, let's call it. And so I want to just, I'll be putting a couple of these sort of things out there, which you can sort of read as we go. But I do think that Rorty was really onto something several decades ago when he talks about interesting philosophy being a contest between an entrenched vocabulary, which has become a nuisance, and a half-formed new vocabulary, which vaguely promises great things. So I would encourage all of you to be vague in your promises of great things and try not to be much of a nuisance. And so hopefully this will help in that regard. And so one of the things that I notice in talking to the students, and I've talked to several of you already this semester, is that there's a real consistent pattern. Not to the work itself, but to the way that the work is described, to the way that the work is situated within broader context, and some of the habits that I think we've kind of have ingrained themselves in prep. And in general, what I see is that when we look at the projects, especially early on, they tend to be too general, too abstract, and too familiar. And anybody that has spoken to me this semester already, you know, that's generally what my opinion has been. And so you know, too general, and we see that I think we're getting better in that regard. We don't have as many these projects about light or nature or things like that, but we probably still have, we could be more specific. The abstraction thing, I mean, any time your thesis is driven by a term that ends in ISM, ITY, OLOGY, TION, or any of those kinds of abstract prefixes that turns a verb into a noun, you're probably on a slippery slope. And then too familiar is that these abstract categories, they actually produce familiarity. If we start off the exercise by saying, I am in the world of radical post-Xism scape, whatever X is the thing, that is exactly the domesticating function that we want to try to keep at bay. So for me, I think to avoid those things is a good thing. And I think a good way to avoid them is to follow, to do that. But also to follow the lead of Colin Rowe when he, in the 1950s, was already calling out the role of the particular, the personal, and the curious as a kind of antidote to systemic architectural formula. So in other words, that is, I hope all of you can kind of point your projects in such a way that it is specific, that it is yours, and that it's a little bit weird. I think all of these will help to inoculate you against the specter of cliché. Now, as I said, that specter of cliché has, I think, a lot to do with the vocabulary that we use. And the vocabulary that we use primarily, even though we're maybe not so explicit about its sources, remains that of critical theory. When I say that, I'm meaning primarily the developments out of cultural criticism, linguistic theory, and philosophy from, say, the 60s into the 90s, and the kind of lingering hangover. So that entire paradigm is, I think, the vocabulary that I see becoming a nuisance, becoming not as useful as it was. Now, what I want to make sure is that this is not taken as an attack on theory, as the next in a long line of post-critical belly aching, but rather that I want to identify what critical theory is good at and hopefully point at some of its blind spots, and then lay out an alternative trajectory that maybe sheds a little bit more light on those blind spots. So when we think about critical theory, and it has done incredible things in architecture and throughout intellectual culture in general. And if we look at this paradigm carefully, and we could start again with the etymology, and we think that the root of the word, the root of critical, comes from the Greek word krainein, which has to do with division and judgment. And theory also takes you back to a Greek word theoria for contemplation and speculation. You take it back a little bit further, you get the verb therein, to consider or speculate. You keep going, you wind up at theros. Thea is a view, horos is seeing. It's related to the theater. If you go back beyond Greek roots, the word actually has certain implications of a pre-Greek word called thauma, which has to do with marvel, which is where the derogatory nature of theory comes in. When you think people saying things like, well, that's only a theory, or I want facts, not theory. That it's slightly, its detachment from reality and its association with distance are built right into the word. If we look a little bit, the mode of critical theory tends to ask questions in the ontological and representational categories. So that critical theory tends to put us in the mood to ask questions like, what is it and what does it mean? Right? These are important questions. These are really useful questions. These are not always the most pressing ones in the design studio. The technique that we use to ask these questions tends to be logical analysis, that the idea has to be held together according to certain, it has to make sense all the way through. It has to be sort of, the principles have to be apparent. We have to understand how the whole thing unfolds. Its character, because of all of these characteristics, it is distant. That if we look at the word has to do with again, with the theater, the theorist is in the audience. Critical distance is taking you out of the heat of the moment in order to have a kind of a more, let's say, a more kind of restrained and passive opinion, and it's also reactive, that criticism tends to happen after the fact, a posteriori, in a sense. And then finally, the aim tends to be classification and judgment. Now again, these are super important things to be able to do. It's very useful to be able to classify things, to take the world and through kind of divide and conquer techniques, be able to sort of put things in their places so that we can kind of make sense of it. And it's also very important to be able to judge things, to be able to say, that's a good one and this is a bad one and here's why. But again, I think Amit really wants to be here, but in any event, there are other ways to go about it. So if theory, the usefulness of theory comes from its tendency to break things down into its parts, to analyze it, to contemplate a unified whole from a distance, it does tend to have shortcomings. It tends to be non-participatory, or at least distant. The action tends to be elsewhere when we're having a theoretical conversation. You don't do theory on the battlefield. The theorist tends to be watching from the audience. The theorist tends to be operating not as an architect, but as a theorist. That division between disciplines is important. And the critic, of course, arrives after the fact and judgments are made after the act. And so if we're doing projects, I mean, we're before the fact. We need to develop techniques for operating that work at the front end. And so these are the kinds of things that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. In the 2GBX seminar, we're looking into these things quite specifically, reading a little bit of Graham Harman and a lot of literary criticism written by authors as opposed to literary criticism written by critics. And so we're really trying to kind of to shift the lens, and I'm just starting to develop a kind of alternative mode that I really hope works, that right now I'm calling narrative discourse. I don't love the title, but I do think it gets at some of the kinds of things that I want to stress in our conversations about the projects. Now, if we look at the etymology of this, narrative has Latin. Primarily, these have Latin rather than Greek roots. Narrare has to do with knowledge and skill. Discurrere tends to mean, and even discourse meant in English until the middle of the 16th century, it had to do with running over a region. If you split that word, dis has to do with a part. Currere means to run, so it's related to currency, it's related to flowing, it's related to now, in a sense. It's timely, we might say. If we look at its mode, the kinds of questions that I'm interested in asking are more operational and organizational. What does it do and how does it work, as opposed to what is it and what does it mean? And here I think this is where there's a certain divide growing between Harman, for instance, where Harman, being a philosopher, being a metaphysician, is very interested in questions like, what is it? He's very interested in the sort of ontological side of things. And I think in the studio, I think we're most effective when we're operational. And the technique, and here I'm borrowing from Richard Rorty, the technique, as opposed to logical analysis, has to do with detailed description. How do you really look at the thing carefully and get into the details? Vladimir Nabokov liked to talk about the necessity of fondling the details when you are working with a literary text, that a good reader was attentive to the details. So the character that I'm after is that it's proximate and current, that you're right there in the thing, you're not establishing critical distance, but you're actually diving into the detail and hopefully being more current. And the aim then would be action and making as opposed to classification and judgment. Now, a solid, well-rounded architect would be nimble in both modes. I think most of us tend to be pretty nimble in the upper side because that's where our training has come from. That's where the sort of sacred texts of the discipline tend to live. But I do think that we could learn a lot from paying attention to that bottom row. Now, this still doesn't get too close to the question of how we do it. And here again, I'm still trying to think it up. But for me, I find myself going back in pursuit of these detailed descriptions, in pursuit of this more kind of engaged form of rhetoric, I find myself going back to formal diagrams. Here's just another quote from Rorty, which I think is good. But I really find that if we're really going to talk about architecture, we should be talking about the stuff of architecture as opposed to the ideas that it may or may not be related to. So as opposed to fifth generation warmed over Marxism, which still tends to haunt the vocabularies that we use. I mean, many of us probably don't even know that we're speaking Marxist when we do these things. But I think to go back to to some of those kind of elements, and here is maybe where I'm a little bit closer to somebody like Harman, like paying very careful attention to the elements and noticing that points, lines, planes, and volumes, all of you have taken my classes, you've all heard this, but knowing that they are not simply abstract neutral forms, but that they actually make certain kinds of claims, that centers and that points and planes tend to argue for center, lines and lines and planes tend to argue for separation, points and volumes tend to argue for a kind of consolidation. And so just being sensitive to the logic of form itself. And there's lots of stuff out here. I mean, I think it would be very easy to look at what I'm laying out here and saying this sounds like a real retreat straight back to the kind of new criticism of the 30s, people like Empson and Fry, et cetera. And maybe it is. But in any event, I think to look at, and Doug Graff, who's certainly been a very big influence on me, to show how any perimeter, which you can see up there, number 9, is eventually going to suggest a center. Any set of modules is eventually going to suggest the sort of axes it defines by absence. And that if you look at things carefully and look at them long enough, they tend to turn into their opposites, that forms tend to be a lot more lively and dynamic than we often give them credit for. And so I think this set of diagrams that demonstrate, you just kind of stare at that square long enough, the corners are going to come into prominence, defining themselves as their own things, which leaves a big void in the middle, which is eventually going to come up and say, I'm important too. And so this cycling of possible readings through very simple configurations, I think this kind of language remains quite valid and useful. And you can say things like, when we look at something like the Temple of Cons, it's making arguments that it is one thing, it is two things, it is a procession, it is a barrier, that something that seems old and kind of exhausted of architectural interest remains through a concentration on its formal particulars quite odd in its multivalence, quite ambiguous in the kinds of meanings that it suggests as opposed to imposes. And we see this kind of thing throughout history. Colin Rowe laying out his 2 paradigmatic diagrams, plan without program or program without plan. Today at SCI-Arc, you should just reverse the captions. That's generally how we tend to think today. But otherwise, the kind of stability of the diagram versus the instability of program. But I want to look at these. These are not, these diagrams should be more than, okay, Rowe has an axe to grind about certain configurations. He likes certain ones better than others. Or Peter Eisenman is making a significant philosophical argument about the nature of form, which he was doing. But what he was also doing in this series of diagrams was telling a fairy tale. He was inventing yet another creation myth for the field. He was developing a story. And the way he developed it was by being incredibly specific about the details to which he was calling your attention. So when we look at, the difference between a square and a rectangle is significant. The distance between the edge of the slab and the columns is super significant. The fact that it is this and not that or any of these, they're all significant in Eisenman developing this story. And it does unfold narratively. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. It has specific techniques associated with it. We could talk about it quite a bit more, but I like to look at this thing not as a sort of statement of truth, but rather as a kind of story, as a fairy tale. I think using the diagram to in a way to kind of set up the mood or to set up the mode of reception in your audience. So Koolhaas using the paranoid critical diagram as a way to kind of get you, I think, in the mood of that particular line of absurdist realism, that particular propensity in Rem to find in the ordinary the extraordinary or the very weird, to be able to see what you're after in places where you might not be looking for it. And I think that this diagram kind of helps, for me anyway, kind of set that there is a sort of sense of humor required, maybe. There are other weirder things. I mean, Graff, again, we could look at something like his transformation of the Villa Savoie into the Palazzo Farnese and back again by turning it upside down and inside out through a series of diagrams which passes through the Stoa at Attalus in the middle, which it's very easy to look at something like this and think, well, that is really kind of stupid or so obviously false, so obviously without serious critical value to the advancement of whatever ismology or other theory that you tend to be advancing. But at the same time, it's kind of fun. I mean, I find this very entertaining. And I also know that it's exactly the technique that was used to produce these things that are down in the gallery right now, which we know came from this thing that Andrew put together a few years ago, and then simply unfolding it and injecting a kind of fictional life force. So the sort of unfolding narrative of that once upon a time there was a building like this. It never got built, but it came to life anyway. It desperately wanted to be a real boy, and somehow at the Venice Biennale it came to life, and now it's walking around in Rome and at SCI-Arc. And here's just a little aside, be sure to cite your sources when you do this sort of thing. This was the drawing that accompanied that model when it was in Venice. So I do think that these, to be able to be attentive to those kinds of particularities of form and organization are super useful, and I would argue probably more useful than trying to cram the complete late writings of whatever expert on post-human thinking you might think is relevant to your theory, to your thesis. Now, another kind of line of questioning that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about lately is character. Hopefully, at least some of you are familiar with the piece that I wrote a couple of years ago in Log on Jason Payne's Raspberry Fields. And it's a building that I find to be very interesting in certain ways. And because I like that it wears its attentiveness to character on its sleeve. So if composition, which we were looking at those diagrams, composition has to do with the organization and formal structure of architecture, I think character has to do with being as specifically attentive to its qualities and effects, to what it's actually doing. So composition in a way maybe has to do with how it works, and character has to do with what it does. Sorta, it doesn't really fit. But we all know that this thing, that Jason's kind of fetishism about the hairiness of the shingles, it turns in, he kind of develops another kind of story, another myth about the actual material properties of wood. He takes a kind of thing that we're always trying to keep from happening to wood, and he tries to figure out how to make it happen in a way that looks great. So he's got to mobilize a lot of architectural intelligence. He's got to understand the history of the site for this particular story that he's telling. And we all know this story. We know that he's injecting a certain amount of livestock into the thing. And so I think we're all very familiar with the story of the fur, but I think less so with the posture of the building, which I think is contributing just as much to its character, which we can see in this kind of warpy plan. And we can, I think now the secret is out that much of that form came not just from studying actual cows out in the middle of nowhere in Utah, but also studying the picturesque theorization of cows by William Gilpin in the 18th century. And so that the posture of the house and the posture of the cow, that there is a sort of specific relationship. And Jason will now admit this. I think for a while he was kind of keeping this a little bit under wraps. But I think that kind of attentiveness, that it's not, this is a scheme that is not about posture, right? And I know there are already a couple of posture projects kind of simmering right now. What I want to avoid is the development too quickly of posturism or posturicity, but rather at least for now, if we're interested in questions of posture, we got to find a specific one. So the specific posture of this cow, the specific posture of the contortionist, which Andrew has been interested in for a long time, or the posture that Jeff is interested in the White Walkers. So again, I mean, much better, in my view, to find a particular instance of whatever abstraction you're interested in, as opposed to trying to construct your thesis as a kind of umbrella over the entire category. So these are all posture projects, and the category posture now becomes interesting for conversation because they're different. They assume very different structures. So thesis point number 4, develop new vocabularies. One more to go. And this one has to do with something that I think Jeff has been sort of talking about a little bit, and I've just noticed some funny resonances with some other things that we were reading. And it has to do with the idea of enfranchisement. And so maybe you've seen this. Jeff just put this out in an interview not so long ago, and he's been saying this anecdotally about the stuff in the gallery quite a bit, where he's interested in the idea that architecture could enfranchise a sloppy, slouching, drunken kind of persona, that you could feel okay in the world without having to stand up straight and assume a certain posture. Now, this is exactly the same thing that Dave Hickey was talking about in the early 90s with respect to Robert Mapplethorpe's work, which was coming under an incredible amount of attack at that time from Senator Jesse Helms and many others. But I think Hickey says it even more succinctly, that the task of beauty is to franchise an audience and to acknowledge its power, to designate a territory of shared values between the image and its beholder, and then in this territory to advance arguments by valorizing the picture's problematic content. So what's happening here and here is not a kind of critical attack on the world of standing up straight or being straight, but rather a kind of celebration of the possibilities that are excluded from that previous paradigm. So there's no apology here, there's no attack here either. And instead, there's a kind of just something else. And it's been quite common to equate Mapplethorpe's work not with subversive critical tactics developed through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but rather with the classical tradition. That in a funny way, Mapplethorpe's particular celebrations of marginal communities, as Hickey puts it, is not at all different from Da Vinci's celebration of what I suspect at the beginning of the 1500s was a marginal community of nerds interested in ancient Greek texts. And so again, I'm just trying to demonstrate that kind of difference, that the point, as Jeff makes it, that buildings like that make you want to stand like this, buildings like that maybe make it okay not to stand like that. It might be that reminds you of something like Weisendorp's paintings that accompanied Delirious New York, of the squiggly, cheating skyscrapers, but in fact I think it's closer to something like Bernard, which maybe sounds like this seems to be a textbook example from the critical tradition, but in fact I think this is again a kind of redescribing what constraints are, that the constraints are not constraints, they're not necessarily bad, but they possibly signal a new kind of freedom. So I think that to make sure that the thesis is sort of positioning itself beyond simple description, beyond just kind of elaborating on what's right there in front of you, it could be pointing to the proliferation of communities, that architecture could have something to say to more than one constituency, that architecture does not need to aim at total world domination, which is what most of the isms and ities of the past century all did. That every time you stick an ism on the end of a noun, it tends to be your license to say this is good for everyone at all times, everybody do it this way. And I think we should resist that. I think we should try to push for smaller, more devoted audiences and more of them, as opposed to one giant one-size-fits-all audience. So just to very quickly review so you don't forget the 5 points of thesis. Privilege difference over similarity. I hope these all add up to a kind of nice, tidy idea. Avoid cliché-making. Privilege how over what. Develop new vocabularies and enfranchise new consistencies. So that's all you have to do. I'm glad that so many of you are taking photographs of this as I look out at you. So that's it. Thanks for listening.